one of the most interesting comic book stores still in existence.
Lots and lots of folks who come in all across the rainbow.
You don't think of it as a store as if you think of it as that place where that friend works. You know what I mean? It's almost like the store has a personality of its own.
And it's the best comic store in the world.
If you wanted to get comic books, actually, for the most part, you had to haunt newsstands.
When I was younger, the only place you could get comics was at like the local corner store, and some other places you would look around, you would find them, but it was really sporadic.
You visited every newsstand possible because some of them were just mundane, some of them would have comics, some of them would actually carry underground comics.
Mail order and fanzine and handwritten letter correspondence going on across decades before this public phenomenon of the early 70s with stores actually opening up for this.
Sometimes you just couldn't find the issues you wanted, so we started going through the yellow pages and looking up any place that sold like used books or used comics.
DC, the Superman, DC, controlled all the distribution. So they controlled, and they would only allow Marvel to have a certain number of titles. And so they would control where those titles went. And I think somebody at DC decided to screw people up every once in a while. Because you'd find, everything but an issue of Conan, for example, or everything but an issue of Iron Man or something like that. And so you'd have to go someplace else to find it. And there was no rhyme or reason to it.
You get to know the owners to find out what day they'd be delivered.
There were magazines that I liked to buy, science fiction magazines and things like that, and they were very sporadic as well. You would get issue 1, issue 2, and then the next one would be issue 6.
There were second-hand stores and stuff like that. Like when I was growing up as a kid in fabulous Rochester, New York, there was a store called the Clinton Bookshop. And the Clinton Bookshop was the size of a football stadium. It's this huge place. And they had new books up front. In the back, they had pulps in one section, and comic books in another section, and old Life magazines in another section besides that. And so you could find just about anything if you knew where to look.
The prices of magazines rose and comics didn't, and they were making a lot more money on magazines. There was no reason to have comic books, or not as much reason to have comic books and give them pride of placement, like they did in the 40s and 50s. So comic stores needed to exist at a certain point.
The Million Year Picnic is such a weird name for a store. No one knew what it was.
So does this place sell extremely durable lawn furnishings? Or are they party caterers to long-duration parties?
The Million Year Picnic was actually the final chapter of Ray Bradbury's Martian Chronicles.
A comic book adaptation of The Million Year Picnic, the short story, was one of the first books that Jerry Wiest ever bought when he was a little boy with his own money.
And Jerry, and I remember he had to fight for this, managed to get the original art to the story when they adapted it in EC Comics. He also managed through Bradbury to get the rights to use the name for the store long before he got the store. Otherwise, I don't think it makes a very good store name at all. That being said, pretty much everyone calls it the Picnic anyway.
And I used to grin as people would sign their checks. You could tell the MIT students 1 times 10 to the 6th, which is 1 million. 1 times 10 to the 6th year picnic. And the more common mistake people would make is they would sign a millionaire picnic or $1 million picnic.
Jerry and his first partner Chuck started the store. I know Jerry sold his comic. He didn't sell his comic collection, but he sold Superman numbers 2 through 100. That's what he sold to help raise money to do it. Don't know what Chuck's buy-in was. Chuck had gone to Harvard, and in fact had been part of the Harvard Comic Book Club.
I always thought of him more of a businessman than Jerry, but both very much into comics and collecting.
They basically were one of the few people who said, we love this stuff. Why don't we have a store devoted to it instead of just it being this thing in the back corner of a pharmacy or something?
The whole society was very judgmental about comic books and reading comics.
Well, first off, it was incredibly tiny.
I think maybe more is almost a push cart kind of thing.
A tight space and very efficiently organized.
It was about the size of a room, basically. It's about the size of this room here. And he had managed to shove a counter in the corner just as you come in, and then around the walls were two of the walls were full of comic books on the walls, and the other two walls were full of books.
It was really more of a Famous Monsters of Filmland / Starlog / Star Trek poster book, science fiction book kind of bookstore.
We had a lot of people coming in who had never seen anything like this. They had all seen their comics at their local convenience store.
The word of a comic book store actually existing was pretty good. It got around.
So the mantra of the comic book owners became, the store owners became, we're going to carry everything good that comes out.
We weren't quick to make something a back issue. So you could come in and find, a year or 2 years of Fantastic Four or X-Men or Batman or Superman on the shelf.
It was art comics, it was foreign comics, it was, whatever.
We tried our best to sell and encourage all the small guys, produced so-called, the independent comic artists.
Even though we have thousands of books on the shelves, almost all of them are worth reading.
If you were looking for the first appearance of Superman, that's where you might get it. If you were selling one, that's the store you wanted to sell it through.
So this was really the first comic specialty store in New England. We're one of the 2 or 3 oldest stores of our kind in the United States.
I had nothing to compare it to. So for me, it was just, I'm going to go down to the comics or I'm going to go to the Million Year Picnic. It didn't occur to me that other cities didn't have that.
Selection is so good. They have such a good collection of independent material and adult material that is not pornographic material. It's just really interesting and mature material.
Long, narrow, and on the other side of on the other side of the aisle here.
It was a comics cave. I remember being really, really dark and just like packed and tight and just tons and tons of back issues.
There was actually a cheesecake place right up front called Rowinski's, and they went out of business, and Barbara and Jerry rented that space and sort of put the new comics up front.
When I was going late teens, it was when there was 2 stores, one across the hall from each other, and there was the back issue store and the new issue store.
The old store was the bigger part of the Million Year Picnic, and that was on the other side of the corridor. And that was probably a good place for it because people would come in specifically to look in that store for certain things. The new store, you could kind of occasionally attract people in from the street.
As the real estate became more expensive and other businesses wanted to expand within the building, we knocked out a wall without a permit and took over another storefront that was contiguous with the storefront up at the front.
And then there was the fire, and we were in a different location for a year or so while the building was being rebuilt, and then we moved back in the basement, but only one side.
So now we have this one continuous space that I think is about 700 square feet.
The picnic was not the same as working at other places in retail.
When I started working at the store, I didn't even meet Jerry for like a couple months.
Jerry was not there very often. He would show up like once every month or so. And even then it was sort of like an in and out thing. I'm going to drop something off, or hey, I want to do a sale. And every 2 months he'd show up and decide the place was a mess, and he'd clean everything and go crazy, and then he'd leave.
It takes a certain personality set to start a business and a different personality set to run the detail work.
I sort of came and talked to Jerry and Barbara, who were then the owners of the store, and said, do you need somebody to manage the store?
One day, I want to say in 1983, Rich Titus, who was the manager then, leaned across the counter and said, you hang out here a lot.
I was looking for work, and I answered an ad in the Boston Phoenix that just said bookstore, Harvard Square, and to call someone named Rich. And it was kind of like, well, when you come in tomorrow, can you work on subscriptions?
I had told Tony, if you're interested, I'd love to work for you. He thought I was kidding.
Craig came in and I was like, oh, what's going on? And he's like, oh, it's just interviewing somebody for a job. Oh, by the way, if you ever want to work here, just let me know. And I'm like, okay. So I did. And as Craig told me, and it has since proven himself, you do not get hired at the picnic, you get sucked in.
Working here is a trap.
Once you come to the picnic, you never quite leave again. You can't escape from the picnic.
I mean, I've turned into a lifer. You know, it's kind of hard to imagine where I go from here.
The ordering, when I first got there, was like, they were just ordering hundreds of copies of X-Men, assuming that that's what they were going to sell, and then they were warehousing hundreds of copies of X-Men because they weren't.
They never knew what they had. They never knew where anything was. When you had to order, when they do the order, they seemed to just pick numbers out of the air.
No one really knew it was in the storage space. And I went back there and cleaned it out, and I found an original painting by Barry Windsor Smith that nobody knew was back there. One of the painting, and it was a Conan painting, or it was a painting of one of the characters. It was beautiful.
It was a stack of books. It was like a photo book, and it was basically butterflies that were butterfly wings like stuck onto women's genitals, and they would be flying through the air or through rainbows. And we found, honestly, about 800 copies of this book sitting like in just boxes that had never been opened.
We were the only major store, so it was like a license to mint money.
And I started publishing comics when I still worked at the Million Year Picnic. And the picnic was instrumental in me being able to do that.
I got a novelization for a book called The Lost Boys, for a movie called The Lost Boys, because I mixed horror and humor. That was sort of what I wrote. And then when that came out, another editor was looking to do a novelization of this movie that they didn't know what the hell to do with, which was the Michael Keaton Batman movie, which was a combination of superheroes and quirky Tim Burton stuff, basically. And so since he liked my Lost Boys thing, and since I just happened to manage a comic book store, he said, why don't you write this book? For various reasons, part of which, of course, the wonder of the book, but also some other stuff going on. It became a bestseller. And so I got my name in the paper. I got all my other books started selling really well along with the Batman book. I appeared on the Today Show. And so it was a huge boon to my career.
Paul Chadwick sent me a 5-page handwritten letter going through my comic very nicely and giving me ideas of what to do and what I should look out for and stuff like that. And that had a huge influence on me because one of the things he told me was, your line work is not varying in line width at all. It's very mechanical. You might want to look into using a brush. That only happened because of the store.
Comics, in its broadest sense, is a really great art form. It combines words and pictures, and it's unique to, it's an American art form.
You have to be concise in what you say, and if you're doing it right, there's an alchemy between what is written and what is drawn.
People have collected comic books from when comic books began.
They would get into comics, and then they would kind of move backwards and try to collect everything that they didn't have.
People would collect comics when they were kids, and then of course they would go away, they would go to school, they would go to the army, they would go to something else, and their mother would throw the collections away.
I think it's that compulsive aspect where you just have to have it, and you have to have it today, or you have to have it as soon as you can get there.
I got to see a few cautionary tales of these other collectors, so I was able to restrain myself.
We would have the children of Texas oil millionaires come in all the time and buy comics as a hedge against inflation.
So there were people starting to invest that really weren't into comic books per se. They didn't enjoy them.
So yeah, initially the new comics were only really a small part of the store. But I think that all changed when in that era around the early 80s, when everybody suddenly decided comic books were worth money.
Oh, I'll just buy always #1s and wait 10 years. That'll be easy.
And thus, no comic book after that period is worth any money at all.
So only really old stuff really retained any kind of value.
And there's occasional book would come out from comics. And from, I would say, the mid-80s through the mid-90s, that totally changed. And suddenly you had books and books and books, both historical records and individual independent books that came out that were about comics. So the graphic novel just exploded.
So now you're getting the comics format being used. It's no longer just a vehicle for different kinds of genre stories, which is pretty much what it was when I was a kid. But now you can, if you like a subject, you can probably find a graphic novel about that subject.
But graphic novels, the idea would be that it's a long-form comic story.
Pretty much the way you imagine a book. It's something complete within 2 covers.
There were still very much the people who wanted the Silver Age original Spider-Man 1 or Amazing Fantasy 15 or, you know, Journey into Mystery 83, all that stuff. But there was a lot more people who would really just like to read that. And they didn't want to go through the hoops or, you know, jump over the obstacles to get this thing. You know, the smell of the paper or the vintageness of the ink just didn't matter. And I think Marvel has proved that, DC has proved that, all of these other companies have proved that now because there's all of this stuff in reprint.
The graphic novel format really has signaled the end of the collector's market.
If you're trying to make a single store just on collectible comics, you know, back issues and stuff, I think that time is done.
Why spend $12 on a back issue for each back issue when you can spend $12 and get the entire story?
When comic fans aged, a lot of the comics aged with them.
Most mainstream comics coming out nowadays are much more mature in content than the mainstream books I was buying in the 70s and 80s. And, you know, I would not take a regular Batman comic off the shelf and give it to an 8 or 9-year-old.
There weren't a lot of comics for kids, and regular comics, Batman, Superman, all those comics were really for grown-ups.
Raw and Love and Rockets kind of changed things. Brought in a lot of traditionally non-comic book readers.
There's somebody who listened to NPR and heard a review of Fun Home, for example, and decided to give it a try.
Well, the Picnic was always very open to getting stuff from alternative sources, like places in Europe. Jerry had a deal with Forbidden Planet, and he would go over there once or twice a year and come back with boxes of this stuff that no one had ever seen. There was some small press stuff that we would buy just because it appealed to either the owner or the manager at the time.
For us, that was great. That was our audience. That was the market that a lot of other comic book stores didn't really tap into.
What was he like? Jerry, what was he like? He just didn't know when to stop. Let's put it that way. You could not rein him in. That was it. And that was the beauty of it. You could not rein him in. When, as I say, when he got interested in something, that was it. And just extraordinary passion.
He almost invented the idea of fandom, as it turned out.
I would say any serious comic fan in the greater New England area would certainly know of him. Out in public, nobody particular. It used to be a very specialty thing.
Oh, he's a character. I mean, he on his desk at home, he had this sign saying Jerry Wiest, Chief Weasel. And that's because he liked to wheel and deal. And he never paid money for anything if he could help it.
The cutting edge of fandom. I mean, his early EC fanzine, Squatron, is a classic fanzine and incredibly well put together for a kid his age. It's the collecting in and of itself, I think, that is the thrill. So, you know, Jerry had like a great comic book collection at one point. Sold a lot of it to start the store. At a certain point, he had an amazing collection of underground comics, as well as original comic art.
We would have people over for dinner, and they found him fascinating because, you know, everybody's a lawyer, they're a doctor, they're into finance, whatever, and here's my husband who makes a living on comic art and science fiction, and they've, you know, all the conversations would gravitate to Jerry because it was fascinating.
If he was talking about a comic that he liked or an artist that he liked, he could like seem to see it in his. He wasn't looking at you. He was seeing whatever it was he was talking about. He just was so into it.
When he beeline for something, you don't get in his way. He was going to go after it. And I think in some instances he might have made a few enemies that way.
Very knowledgeable about comics, especially ECs, which I also liked a lot. And he was obviously from Kansas, which was kind of unusual.
He used to work in the grocery store, and he used to buy 2 sets of comics, one to read and one to put into a little case, a little plastic bag. And then when his buddies used to come over, in fact, his best friend Roger Hill would tell me, oh my God, Jerry would have a conniption because they would get into the ones that were in the bags, not the one that were meant to be read.
He found a way to codify that, what makes something valuable and what helps the condition, what constitutes good condition for what kind of comic from what era.
There is a fine line between collecting and hoarding.
Jerry was never a hoarder, and the reason being is that he had respect for everything he bought.
Jerry moved to New York City to pursue a career in art, but I knew what happened when he was agreeing to come to Boston to Chuck. He was subleasing the last of his apartment. He was trying to sublease the remaining lease he had on that. So he had an ad in, and he had people coming in to look at it, and one of them pulled out a weapon, tied him up, and stole everything he could in the apartment. And that was Jerry's goodbye to New York.
He started having some shows in and around Boston.
I had to go through all his files, and there were all the old pamphlets that he had promoting his art at different galleries and his price point, and also his letters, of course, all the letters of rejection. But then there are the letters where, yes, we'd be delighted to have a show. And his explanation of his paintings. So I read through all this before I was cleaning out the files, and I felt I knew him. Unfortunately, after he died, I knew him better as a painter.
He would go ballistic if you did something he didn't agree with. I mean, he would literally explode in anger. And the first time it happened, it was kind of shocking because he wasn't really like an angry person per se. He would come in and leave, you wouldn't see him that much, and then he would come in and he just would explode. I mean, screaming and yelling. I mean, he would really turn beet red. He would be so mad over anything, something. And then sometimes he would just storm out of the store. And then he would come back, sometimes a few minutes later, sometimes a few days later, and say, about that thing we were talking about.
He put out the original underground price guide for comic books and a price guide for underground art. He began, he was the first person to actually auction comic book art off and comic books, and he formed a whole separate market for that.
And he took it to a step that nobody ever was really thinking about at the time. But Russ Cochran somehow got a hold of the original art for the EC comics and would do auctions of it. And of course, these auctions were known of by a handful of people. The world at large couldn't have cared less. And Jerry loved certain artists from that time, like, Jack Davis or certainly Wally Wood and people like that. And just the idea of being able to own their originals thrilled him and this small group of others. So he was really into buying that kind of stuff. He got it professionally framed. He had it up in his library. But then at the end of his tenure at the Picnic, he started getting chummy with folks at Sotheby's.
I don't think a lot of people would have had the chutzpah to come to Sotheby's and Christie and say, hey, you want to do a comic auction? I just don't think they would have said, they're too hoity-toity. They're not going to be interested in this. But he had the confidence, and he believed in the fact that this was a fine American art form, and he was going to take it to that level.
Schomburg was one of them, I think that was the guy's name, was doing oil painting reproductions of his covers.
He was very clever about the way he did it. He would approach different artists to do comic cover recreations.
And those would go into the auction. And he was able to ferret out this stuff and find, original Kirby pages, original Ditko pages or whatever, and really added, a whole prestige to the comic art auctions as well as the comic art itself.
Even when he was, poor thing, when he knew he was going to be dying, he was nailing things on the wall, paintings. He was just constantly at it.
I keep using that word passion, but it's true because You wouldn't go through all the aggravations of running a small business with a non-guaranteed financial return unless you're partly doing it for the fun.
Somebody had a really horrible experience as a woman going into a comic shop somewhere. I don't remember exactly where in the country it was, but it was in the United States. And as a response to that, many people started saying things like, well, my comic shop is great. They're really nice to women. They have no problems with lesbians or gays, transgendered folks, etc. And they started this whole movement of what stores are good to go to. And we were among the very first nominated.
We're seeing more people of color, though we need to see even more, I think. I think we definitely see a lot more female creators.
It wasn't just a boys club. I mean, there were always women working there.
You got younger people that were just getting into comics that really wanted to talk to older people who knew a lot about them.
What I call the Wednesday aspect, I think that really has created a whole community in comic book stores, because you have to go in every week, every month, well, whatever your schedule is, where if you go into a bookstore, you know, because you can go in anytime you want or whatever, there's not that community.
I wouldn't say it was a community, I would say it was communities. And a lot of it had to do with the people who were working there.
For the most part, everybody there is pretty happy to be there and enjoys working with customers.
Everyone who comes feels at home and can get together and talk about what they want and enjoy it, and no one's going to make fun of them.
People who know one another, you know, there's the person who's going to come in and talk movies with you, the person who's going to talk baseball, the person's going to talk about the marathon they just ran. There's so many wonderful human beings who just sort of bounce through the doors.
And there were people there that really knew what they were talking about.
People would always have information about what was forthcoming in comics, and I'd be like, how do you possibly know this?
We made a great fraternity of our colleagues that we can trust and share some of these, what at the time were obscure interests.
Honestly, I can't tell you the number of times where I've turned to a customer and said, like, will you take the counter while I run and grab a sandwich, or while I do this? There are not a lot of businesses where you like leave your customer with your cash register.
H.R. Giger came in, and he was, of course, this very nice Swiss gentleman.
And this guy walks up to me and says, "Hi, my name is Matt Groening, and would you like me to sign some of the comics that I have here?" I'm like, sure, that'd be great. And he not only signed every comic we had, he signed all of his Life in Hell book, his School is Hell book, and he drew cartoons in all of them.
Stephen King would come into the store with his kids, and he would leave his kids with us, and he would go do something and then come back.
So I really like that kind of, I like that community aspect of comic stores. And I think of that as like one of the last great places for that kind of specialized, weirdo culture.
They could walk into our specialty shops, and not only had we heard of their favorite author, we might even be able to discuss them knowledgeably or ask them, what do you like about him, so we can at least pass that on to another customer.
It's been a very friendly store to go into and talk to people and find stuff. And they're very good about finding stuff for you if it's available. I mean, it's very good. Nobody ever looked down on anybody coming into the Millionaire Picnic. Everybody's willing to talk about stuff. Everybody's willing to, to be helpful.
And the people who work there are not just they're not just there to sell you a comic book. They're going to talk to you. And they'll probably work up friendships the way that we did and the way that people who've worked there have always done.
It is a big family. I even met my wife sort of through the store in a way.
I've seen, families go in there. I've gone in there with my own family and my own kids, and I've seen people bring their kids in. On occasion, I've seen kids force their parents to read something, and their parents actually like it.
We've gone through all these different eras, good times, bad times, all the ups and downs. But sort of that camaraderie and that community has been a constant.
The comic book store guy. I hate to say it, but I've been to a number of comic stores where that's who owns it and that's who works there, is the opinionated guy who knows everything and you know nothing. And doesn't necessarily have good social or hygiene skills, and that's not the picnic.
I made an effort to greet every person who comes in. I say hi to pretty much everybody. I say, can I help you find anything after they've been in for a little while?
Once you do work there, you kind of always have a connection there. You always have a connection there. Even clients that didn't know me, like when they find out that I used to run the store 27 years ago, they suddenly they're your best friend.
It's people who know what they're selling and care about it. You can't get that wandering into Best Buy.
You can get insulted for free. You don't have to walk into a store to get insulted.
The original comic conventions were structured the same way that the science fiction conventions were, which went back to the 1930s.
It used to be you would want to do a local convention because you'd have a bunch of people coming to your table that would never have come to your store.
A steadily smaller percentage of them is devoted to the actual original content that the comic or the author produced.
When you do an Iron Man movie, there are 40 Iron Man graphic novels, and the movie may not be based on source material from any of them.
Movie and television tie-ins eventually became very big, but initially they were just part of science fiction.
The television shows are also comics. The characters that are coming out of the TV shows are going into comics, and some of the comic characters are going into the TV shows.
Now 30,000 people go to the Boston Comic Convention, and they get, actors from Game of Thrones going there. I mean, it's not even about comics anymore.
Conventions have evolved across the decades into mega conventions, where it's far more commercial and far more driven by publicity for the spin-offs of these conventions, the movie adaptations of Marvel heroes.
For a long time, these were considered fringe elements of society.
And unless you've got a big name or somebody that people really want to see, I don't think it's going to really draw anybody.
They're looking for stars now.
There is some crossover. There's a fair number of people who, after the movie or before the movie, whatever the movie is, come in and they want to read the book.
I think as everything has come up, superheroes are popular. It doesn't particularly help comic book stores. There's a difference between watching a movie and reading.
If Batman stopped being produced, eventually it would be very hard for a movie producer to make a Batman movie, because they're generally taking what they consider to be the most successful storylines, and they're adapting them for a multi-million-dollar audience instead of a couple 100,000 people or however many they sell.
There's a dramatic decrease in people who are buying individual issues. We've seen that number drop continuously. It used to be that a big title would have 100, 150 subscribers, something like that. Now, a really big title for us has 50 subscribers.
Well, I think the biggest challenge for the future, is sort of remaining relevant, print and paper in a world that's becoming increasingly digital.
And the people who need to have that physical object, that comic actually printed in 1964, there's just not as many of them out there anymore. And while those people are still willing to pay top dollar for that, there's not enough product and there's not enough audience to keep that part going.
Digital is for people who want to read everything and have it very conveniently accessible. There it is. You can put a lot that way. For somebody who wants an artifact, which is equally valid, to want the artifact, then you go for the buying a regular comic book.
You can buy a subscription to the Marvel or DC library and literally have thousands of back issues that you can read for a cheap monthly fee.
You can buy stuff cheaper as a digital reprint if you're after wanting to read the content rather than own the original crumbling first issue non-acid-free paper turning into dust copy.
I'm as guilty of this as anybody. I buy most of the comics that I read online. Part of the reason is that I don't have room for them anymore.
The specialty knowledge of the specialty store staff is not as big a factor anymore.
People are looking up and finding tons of web-based comics that speak to their particular thing.
People still have the desire to actually have these things. And so when a popular web strip gets put in book form, it sells like crazy. People, and the free distribution on the web acts as an advertisement for the actual book that will come out.
There are art books too where the reproductions digital just don't look as good as they do on a printed page.
The book The Wimpy Kid, which I think has sold 70 million copies, is available on free online. It has been for more than a decade, but the guy has still sold 70 million copies. If you make something that they want, that that they find enduring, they're going to want a format that is enduring.
I think that the market just fragments more, and you have more people who are interested in these different things. And so I don't think comic books, I don't think graphic novels will ever go away completely.
People like, they like bookstores. You know, they just like having them in their neighborhood. They like them as a meeting place. They like to browse through them. You can kind of browse through a bookstore differently than you can a lot of other kinds of stores. And I think that it certainly would be a long time before like the allure of books just like disappears.
As long as there's people who want to know something about graphic novels and want to be able to browse in some place, the problem with Amazon is you cannot browse. You want to browse in some place and find the serendipity of finding something new or being able to talk to somebody about what's really going on or something like that. Then I think comic book stores like the Million Dollar Picnic will continue to survive.
Well, they've been around for what, 40-something years, so I don't see the culture shifting that much. That there would be no need for it anymore. I don't see that.
They're like old friends, right? Like you like going to that place. You like, if you go into the Picnic and it looks a little shabby, you're like, he's not doing well. What's up with so-and-so? I need to see him more often.
Best job I ever had, hands down. I've worked now in retail for a little over 30 years, and almost half of that was working at the Picnic.
I really enjoy reading comics. I love reading comics. It's so much fun.
It's been a fun way to make a living. It hasn't always been the easiest way to make a living. But at the end of the day, we do something that I'm proud of.
It was the only job I miss. If the Million Year Picnic was here where I live now, I would be applying for a part-time job.
I suppose it's become sort of an institution, and it may not necessarily have thrived as an institution just because of the economy, but it survives.
People can come, where people can hang out, where people can find good stuff to entertain them, to make them laugh, to make them feel, to make them think. That's what we've been doing. That was sort of our mission. It's still our mission now.